Hello, my name is Garchompro, and I've been Challenger since Set 2. With Ornn coming back into the meta, I figured now is as good a time as any to go through how to play every single Ornn item. In this video, I'll be going through every single Ornn item from highest average placement to lowest average placement, discussing the best holders of the items as well as how to play around them. The first Ornn item we'll be talking about is going to be Tricksters Glass, which is actually the highest average placing Ornn item in the game right now. Tricksters Glass is extremely powerful in the early game. Being able to just get an extra unit is really powerful when you only have like 4 or 5 units on your board, and is still a pretty solid item in the late game. The first thing with Tricksters Glass is that it actually opens up a couple strategies. The first of which is going to be Tricksters Glass Talia. Now, if you saw my most recent video, you would have seen that I talked about how you can play Talia with either Double Trouble or Too Healthy. That being said, there is another way you can play Talia, and that is with Tricksters Glass. You just want to play the Talia comp we talked about, but instead use Tricksters Glass on your Talia, so that way you have 2 Talia 3s. Both these Talia 3s are going to be ulting, CCing units, knocking them up, and then hitting each other's knockups with their boulders, so you just have a ton of damage coming out. Every time a unit gets knocked up, you typically just get a kill because you have 2 Talia 3s hitting it, so really powerful strategy here. Another powerful Tricksters Glass strategy is to use Tricksters Glass on your Auction. That way you have 2 Auction 3s that are both going to be able to snipe down a unit every time they ult, allowing you to just evaporate the enemy team really quickly. Another way you can play this is you can run 4 Deadeye. With 2 Auction 3s and 4 Deadeye, you're typically going to be just one-shotting whatever unit you Deadeye proc, so that is another strategy that is opened up with Tricksters Glass. Outside of those strategies, there's some other units that hold Tricksters Glass really well in the late game. My favorite is going to be Senna. Tricksters Glass Senna is really powerful. Just having 2 Sennas, allowing them both to ult and shield your entire team and give bonus attack speed is really powerful, so I like that. Scion is also really good. 2 Scions is going to be more CC. They're also going to live really long due to his passive, allowing him to revive, so it's just a bunch of free frontline. Rise is another really good one. If you have a good Rise portal like Ionia or Freljord or even like Shurima, is really powerful to get extra CC down on the board. 2 Rises casting is just more CC, really powerful there. Another really good one is Jarvan. You can put Tricksters Glass on your Jarvan and put your Jarvans on opposite sides of the board to guarantee that you're going to CC your opponent's carry no matter what side they're on. The one thing I would say is be cautious when running Tricksters Glass Jarvan. A lot of times he won't be able to ult due to the fact that Tricksters Glass is making you only have 70% health and 20% reduced mana. So make sure that your Tricksters Glass Jarvan is not immediately taking focus fire, or else it's actually not going to be able to ult because it's just going to have too high of a mana pool. Another good one is Nasus. Having 2 Tricksters Glass Nasuses is going to be a lot of free frontline for your board. In addition to that, each Nasus is going to ult and steal stats from the enemy team, so you'll be able to just steal a bunch of stats if you have 2 Nasuses on your board. Another one that's really good is Katarina. I haven't run it myself, but it has very good stats, so if you're playing like a Noxus or a Zed comp, I highly recommend playing a Tricksters Glass Katarina. You should be able to spread a lot of anti-heal and do a bunch of free damage to the enemy team. Of course, there's a couple other strategies you can use with Tricksters Glass. Another one I've seen is Lux. You have 2 Luxes, and they both can just one-shot a unit at the start of the fight, is really powerful. And you can really just put Tricksters Glass on any upgraded unit you have in the late game. Something like a Shen or a Sejuani for extra frontline should be fine. You can also just put it on a random 2-star unit just to buff up your team's damage. You know, a backline 2-star should be fine. These, however, are what I think are the best Tricksters Glass units in the late game. In the early game, I recommend just putting Tricksters Glass on whatever upgraded unit you have. You just want to have an extra 2-star on your board, so whatever your first upgrade is should be taking your Tricksters Glass in the early game. Next, we have Eternal Winter. Now, Eternal Winter is extremely powerful in the early game and extremely powerful in the late game. It's just really strong at all stages in the game. Whenever you have Eternal Winter, the thing you want to focus on is making sure that you have 2 other tank items on your tank. This is going to enable them to actually live a long time and keep proccing the Eternal Winter and get to the CC effect of the Eternal Winter while continually slowing the enemy team. If you don't have tank items on your Eternal Winter unit, they're just usually going to die at the start of the fight and not do that much. My personal favorite build with Eternal Winter is going to be Stoneplate plus Warmogs. The reasoning for this is you can solo frontline your unit with a Stoneplate, and it's going to have really good synergy with Eternal Winter. The entire enemy team will be attacking them, so they'll get more Stoneplate value, and they'll also be slowing down the entire enemy team. Warmogs is just really good to build into HP because you're already building into armor with the Stoneplate. That being said, you can go other tank items as well. Dragon's Claw, Bramble, Vow, and Redemption are also great options with your Eternal Winter, so feel free to go for that. In the early game, you're typically going to want to be putting this on whatever your tank are. Maokai, Renekton, Irelia, and Swain are the most common tanks you're running in the early game, but you might be running something else as your tank, so feel free to just put Eternal Winter on that. In the late game, you're going to want to be putting it on the late game tanks, so Shen, Sejuani, Nasus, and Scion are the general late game tanks. If you're playing a reroll composition, a lot of times you'll be running Maokai or Poppy as a tank. Those are great. If you're playing Sorceress, Swain is a great tank for them, and he can hold the Eternal Winter. Another one that's actually good is Urgot. He shields himself. He's actually quite tanky. He's going to run into the enemy team. Everything's going to be focus firing him, and he can slow everything down. so Urgot's also another great holder of Eternal Winter. Again, you want to make sure that you have 2 other tank items on these units if you're going to be running them with Eternal Winter. If you're playing a composition that doesn't run one of these units, I would not recommend going for Eternal Winter just because you're generally not going to have as tanky of a unit with it. A lot of other units can hold it, but not as well. For instance, something like Jarvan can hold an Eternal Winter, but his ability doesn't make him any tankier, which means he's not going to live as long as these units shown right here, making him a worse Eternal Winter holder in general. The next Ornn item is going to be Infinity Force. Now the thing with Infinity Force is it's going to be giving HP, attack speed, AD, AP, mana, armor, and magic resist, which means we'll want to be using it on a unit that is going to use all or almost all of those stats. What this typically is going to be a carry, because they're going to be using the AD, AP, and attack speed well, but then typically a melee carry because then they'll also enjoy the HP, armor, and MR. It's a very, very strong item in the early game due to the fact that a lot of raw stats is really powerful early, and it's pretty solid in the late game as well. I think the best holder of it early game is going to be Viego, just due to the fact that he's a bruiser carry in the early game, meaning he'll use all the stats, but realistically you can use it on any carry you have early game, it's going to be fine, they're going to enjoy the stats no matter what. When it comes to late game, we're typically going to be using it on bruiser carries. So here, Katarina, Darius, Zed are great melee carries, as well as Yasuo. These are all just great melee carries that are going to be using all the stats. Gwen and Bel'Veth are also really good because they end up jumping into the enemy team, and same thing with Urgot, these units just enjoy the armor, MR, health stats in addition to the damage stats. Next we have Blacksmith's Gloves. Now Blacksmith's Gloves is a really strong option that's really great on a secondary carry or a secondary tank, just giving you a bunch of immediate value, and is fantastic early game and solid in the late game as well. Now with the item, typically what we're going to want to do is put it on a unit that's going to use as many Ornn items as possible. There's a lot of tank Ornn items and a lot of damage Ornn items, which means we typically want to be putting it on a unit that both tanks and does damage. In the early game, I typically would like to just throw it on whatever tank I have, due to the fact that even in the early game, your tanks are usually doing a decent amount of damage, whereas late game, your tanks don't necessarily do that much damage. I think Swain, Irelia, and Viego are great for this because they do a lot of damage in addition to tanking really well. Renekton is another good option too. Then when it comes to the late game, you can throw it on whatever secondary carry or secondary tank you have, but my favorites are going to be Gwen, Nasus, Yasuo, and Urgot. This is due to the fact that all these units end up wanting to tank a decent amount. Of course, Gwen, Yasuo, and Urgot are going to be running into the enemy team, and Nasus is a tank, but all these units also do a good amount of damage, meaning they're going to enjoy the damage Ornn artifacts as well. Next, we have Death's Defiance. Now, Death's Defiance is very, very strong in the late game, but pretty weak in the early game. This is due to the fact that Death's Defiance gives your units a couple extra seconds of life after they're hit by a really strong burst of damage, but damage is a lot less bursty in the early game, so having a couple extra seconds of life isn't quite as impactful early. The other part of that is the interaction with Death's Defiance is typically your unit will take damage, but live because they have Death's Defiance. Then they will gain mana from that, ult, and heal back up to full. In the early game, however, your units aren't going to be doing as much damage, so they won't be healing back up to full before they take the delayed damage from Death's Defiance, just making the interaction a bit weaker. When you're running Death's Defiance, you do want to keep in mind that it gives AD, attack speed, and armor, which means we're ideally going to want to be using it on melee bruisers that are going to be taking damage and healing it back up, and ideally AD ones, that way they gain the full effect of the AD. In the early game, I think Viego is going to be the best with this because he's going to be taking damage and healing it back up. That being said, if you aren't running a Viego, you can just put it on whatever tank you have. I just have it on an Irelia right here, just to let your tank live a couple extra seconds and buy time for your backline. In the late game, the best units for this are going to be your AD bruisers, being Zed, Darius, Rek'Sai, Yasuo, Urgot, and Bel'Veth for the reasons I talked about before. AP bruisers also do pretty well with it, Gwen and Katarina. You're losing the AD stats from the Death's Defiance, but they're still going to be using the interaction just like the AD bruisers will. Nasus is another good one. He wants to be tanking, so living a couple extra seconds is quite good for him, and he actually does a good amount of damage too, so he'll be able to heal back a decent amount of it. Zeri, or whatever other AD carries you have, is also solid with this. Backline AD carries do use it decently well due to the fact that they do enjoy the healing from it. That being said, the interaction for them is a bit weaker than the bruisers, so I would recommend trying to play towards a bruiser if you have Death's Defiance, but if you end up getting like a really good Zeri or a Filio spot, you can just put it on them. In addition, if you have the Kassadin or Warwick hero augments, it's going to be really solid on them. They're both going to be in the enemy team taking a lot of damage and wanting to heal it back, so really powerful on those as well. Next we have Deathfire Grasp. Deathfire Grasp is really good in the early game and in the late game, due to the fact that being able to do % max health onto the enemy's tankiest unit at the start of a fight in the early game with it is really powerful, and in the late game you typically have a lot of damage at the start of combat, so being able to buff up your carry's damage during the first 8 seconds is really powerful. The first thing to keep in mind is that Deathfire Grasp should only be used on an AP unit, due to the fact that it gives 50 AP, so it's basically 5/7 of a death cap, meaning that if you are not running it on an AP unit, you're losing out on a lot of value. In the early game, you'll typically want to be putting it on whatever AP carry you have. Malzahar, Cassiopeia, Vel'Koz, and Karma are the most common. Another one that works is going to be Viego, but I think Viego's a bit worse with it due to the fact that Viego's damage is ramping, and you typically want to have front-loaded damage with Deathfire Grasp. Make sure that your unit is in front of the enemy's tankiest unit, that way you can do the percent max health to their super tank. In the late game, we want to be using it on AP carries that do damage at the start of combat. Lux is the best one due to the fact that she can typically just blow away a unit immediately if she has this item. Gwen is another good one as she'll be able to just burst through a unit really quickly as well. Katarina, Vel'Koz, Talia, and Lissandra are great reroll options with this. They're going to be able to ult start of combat, just burst through a unit or two and be able to fully utilize that start of combat damage. Next we have Randuin's. Now Randuin's is definitely in the top 3 for early game along with Eternal Winter and Tricksters. And this is due to the fact that the stats it gives are extremely powerful for the early game. A great comparison for another gold augment is going to be Unified Resistance 2, which gives 30 armor and magic resist, but Randuin's is giving 40 armor and magic resist to your whole team. That being said, Randuin's is pretty weak in the late game due to the fact that it requires you to clump, which once people start getting units like Jarvan online is really weak, as you'll just get your entire team CC'd. That being said, I do love taking Randuin's at 2-1 and win streaking with it. You can put Randuin's on any unit. I typically will just position my units like so, with my ranged units in the back right here and my melee units up front. I typically like the left corner just due to the fact that it's easier to position than the right corner as you get an extra hex. One thing to keep in mind though is to make sure that you don't accidentally trap your carry. Let's say in this scenario here that I have a Malzahar and he's the carry. With these Oriannas right here around the Malzahar, what can happen is an enemy unit might stop 4 hexes away from the Oriannas. If that unit stops 4 hexes away from the Oriannas will not move because they'll be in auto attack range of that unit. However, because the Oriannas are only 4 hex range and Malzahar is also 4 hex range, the Malzahar will not be able to hit the unit that the Oriannas are hitting, trapping him and essentially causing him to do nothing. So whenever you're clumping in the corner like this, make sure that you don't trap. My recommendation is just put one of these 3 slots next to the Malzahar as a melee unit, and if you do that, it won't happen. So if I just replace the Orianna with a melee unit, or like right here, the Malzahar will be able to walk around because the melee unit will have to walk up. In terms of late game positioning with Randuin's, I typically will position something like this. Just all my melees in a circle right here, because your melee units, you know, your tanks, you want to be getting the Randuin's value. You don't care as much about your ranged units getting the value, and you don't want to be full clumping your team, so something like this is going to be ideal in the late game. Next we have Anima Visage, which is very strong in the early game and a bit weaker in the late game. This is due to the fact that late game fights tend to be a lot quicker, and units tend to get bursted down a lot faster, meaning that percent max health healing per second is a lot weaker in the late game, where your fights are shorter, and you'd much rather have just flat stats like a Dragon's Claw or a Bramble Vest. In the early game, however, Anima Visage is very, very strong and can enable a win streak. I would only take this if you have another tank item, and you're just going to put it on whoever your main tank is. These are the most common ones in the early game, but you could use another unit as your main tank as well. As a note, I do have Warmogs shown on all of these. This is because Warmogs is really, really strong in the early game. That being said, Warmogs does actually have a bit lower value with Anima Visage compared to other items. This is due to the fact that Anima Visage already gives 500 HP, so stacking more HP is going to be lower value than stacking armor or magic resist. Going into the late game, you're going to want to be putting it on your late game tanks, which is typically going to be a Nasus, Shen, Sejuani, or Sion, or a Poppy 3 or Maokai 3 if you're rerolling those. I wouldn't recommend going for Anima Visage if you're not going to be playing a comp that runs one of these units, as you're going to not be able to get that much value out of it if you don't have a strong tank. Another unit you can actually put it on is going to be Gwen. Gwen functions as a pretty good pseudo tank in a lot of compositions. This is due to the fact that her Shadow Isle shield actually makes her quite tanky, so you can definitely throw it on a Gwen if you don't have another good unit to put it on, and just have Gwen be a bit tankier on your board. One other note with Anima Visage is one trick you can do is actually position your Anima Visage unit on the opposite side of the opponent's anti-heal. So for instance, in this scenario, if my opponent has this Renekton with a Sunfire Cape, what I can do is put another unit in front of the Renekton to prevent the Renekton from moving, and then put my Sejuani on this side. That way the Sunfire Cape won't apply onto my Sejuani, meaning that I'm going to be getting the full value out of my Anima Visage heal. Finally, make sure that you have 2 other tank items on your Anima Visage unit. That way you're getting the full value of your percent max health heal. Next we have Manazane. Now Manazane is a bit weak in the early game, but extremely powerful in the late game. This is due to the fact that when fights are quicker in the late game, it's really impactful to be able to get out a couple casts from your main carry immediately, and just do a bunch of damage and blow up the enemy board. Whenever you have Manazane, you're going to want to be building AP items and playing towards an AP carry, because they're the ones who are going to be valuing their casts more. One interesting thing is that Manazane actually does give attack damage, but you generally want to ignore that and just throw it on an AP carry. In the early game, these are the traditional AP caster carries you'll be running, so you're generally going to be putting Manazane on one of these. In the late game, if you're rerolling any of the multicasters, it is fantastic on all of them. They all have the potential to just blow up a board with the Manazane and do a ton of damage. Another unit that uses it really well is Ahri. Ahri really wants to get to her third cast as fast as possible, and Manazane's going to really enable that. It's going to give her 30 extra starting mana, allowing her to get her first cast really quickly, and then give the bonus mana for the second, third cast. Manazane Ahri is a fantastic win condition for something like Sorcerers, and it's going to allow her to get out that third cast really quickly. Ryze and Heimerdinger are also great as options for a support role with Manazane. Heimerdinger will be able to get off his second ult really quickly and stun the enemy team again. And Ryze, again, if you're running a good Ryze such as Freljord, Ionia, or Shurima, you'll be able to get off that valuable CC faster on the second cast. One other note is that Manazane will typically be taking the place of your mana item on these carries. So typically on Vel'Koz, you want to run like Shojin or Blue Buff +2. If you have a Manazane, you can forego that mana item and just run Manazane +2. This is because you want to make sure your casts are doing as much damage as possible with Manazane. That way you just get your 3 casts off at the start of the fight, do tons of damage, and one-shot the enemy board. Next we have Sniper's Focus. Now Sniper's Focus is pretty decent in the early game as some supplemental damage, but is really great in the late game once you can get to a carry that really abuses it. In the early game, you're typically going to want to put it on whatever ranged unit you have. Jhin is probably the best due to the fact that his ult can hit pretty far, meaning that you're getting good sniper's value off of that, but whatever ranged unit you have in the early game is fine. When we get to the late game, what we want to do is put it on a unit that's going to be hitting more than their normal range. It's fine on any ranged carry in the late game, something like an Azir uses it fine, but we ideally want to be putting it on these units that are going to be hitting more than 4 hexes away. Kai'Sa is a great option because she hits units that are oftentimes 8 hexes away after she dashes. Karma can hit across the map and snipe a unit with Sniper's Focus. Vel'Koz and Sona also both hit across the map, and Akshan always targets the farthest unit, making him actually the best snipers holder in the game. Another one to note is Zeri. Zeri isn't that good right now, so I wouldn't recommend running her this patch, but in the future when she probably will get buffed, Snipers is good on her due to the fact that she chains her lightning to units far away, and she'll be able to get bonus damage off of that with the snipers. Next we have Obsidian Cleaver. Now Obsidian Cleaver is pretty in the early game just due to the fact that the value of armor shred during like stage 2 isn't as high because a lot of the enemy tanks won't have that much armor, so you won't have to pierce through that much. That being said, going into the late game, it becomes quite good as a way to pierce through enemy tanks once they start getting stuff like a Bramble Vest or Stoneplate online and have really high armor counts. That being said, I don't love Obsidian Cleaver due to the fact that you can simply just build a Last Whisper and save your augment, but if you aren't able to get armor shred online, Obsidian Cleaver becomes a good substitute. It becomes bad though once you get to Heimerdinger, as you can just go double shrink plus Mechano on the Heimerdinger and shred through enemies that way, but during the mid game, if you need some sort of armor shred, Obsidian Cleaver can definitely work. One other note with Obsidian Cleaver is that it does give 25 AD, so we typically want to be using it on AD units. It can be used on AP units if you really need some sort of form of magic shred, but we ideally want to be putting it on AD units. In the early game, these are going to be your standard AD carries, so typically you want to put that on one of these. And then going into late game, Senna is definitely the best abuser of Obsidian Cleaver. This is due to the fact that Senna's ult will pretty much always hit the entire board, meaning that she'll be able to apply the Obsidian Cleaver effect to every unit she hits, and she scales well off of AD, so she's going to enjoy the AD from Obsidian Cleaver. You can also put Cleaver on any of your AD carries, so here just Zeri, Aphelios, Urgot, Yasuo, Bel'Veth, or any other AD carry you're running is going to use it fine. In addition, you can use it on supporting units that are going to be able to hit lots of enemies, due to the fact that Obsidian Cleaver will proc off of abilities and auto attacks, so a unit like Kai'Sa or Sona that hits a lot of units with their ability will use Obsidian Cleaver pretty well, but you are losing the value of the AD from the Obsidian Cleaver, so keep that in mind. Next we have Gold Collector. Now Gold Collector is really good in the early game if you have a strong board and you use it to generate economy and snowball your economy due to the fact that you're killing a lot of units and generating gold per round. That being said, it's a pretty weak item in the late game due to the fact that its effect is just weaker than all of the other Ornn items in terms of combat power, so I would not recommend taking this in the late game or if you have a weak board. In the early game, you're typically going to be putting this on AD units, as Collector gives AD and crit chance as part of his combat stats. So these are going to be the standard AD carries you have early game, but you can realistically throw it on whatever carry you have in the early game to generate as much gold as possible. Once you get to the late game, one thing you're going to want to do is try and get an infinity edge with Collector. This is due to the fact that Collector gives crit chance, meaning that we want to have the ability for us to ability crit so that way we're making full use of the bonus crit chance from Collector. These are going to be the standard AD carries that use it, Akshan, Zed, Darius, Yasuo, Aphelios, Bel'Veth, and Tristana, but you can use it on any other AD carry if you're running a different AD carry. One note is that Zeri is one of the AD carries that would use this well, but part of the value of Collector is that it allows you to execute units that are low health, but Zeri's ultimate already allows her to do that, so her synergy with Collector is a bit worse. That being said, you can run Collector on a AP unit with Jeweled Gauntlet, as it'll allow them to ability crit, and the Collector will give them the crit chance value. That being said, this is going to be worse than an AD unit simply just due to the fact that you're not going to be getting the AD value from the collector, but it is definitely an acceptable substitute if you have AP items and not AD items. Next we have Hullcrusher. Now Hullcrusher is pretty good in the early game, but is a lot weaker in the late game just due to the fact that the flat stats it gives are a lot weaker than a lot of the other Ornn options in the late game. You're typically going to be putting Hullcrusher on your main tank as it gives armor, magic resist, health, and attack speed. And then just make sure, of course, that you have your unit isolated, not with any units next to them, so that way they get the full Hullcrusher value. One other thing to note is that it does give attack speed, which means that in the early game, it's actually pretty good on bruiser units, so Viego's a great example here, because he's going to be taking damage and wants the bonus attack speed from Hullcrusher. So Viego actually uses it better than a lot of the tanks do in the early game, but your tanks will be using it a lot better than your backline units. In the late game, though, you typically don't want Hullcrusher on your carry because you want 3 proper carry items, so it's generally just going to be going on your tank in the late game. Nasus, Scion, Shen, and Sejuani are going to be the main ones. Nasus uses it really well because Nasus enjoys the attack speed, unlike Scion, Shen, and Sejuani. Scion likes the attack speed a decent amount, though, but it's still typically just going to be best on whatever your tank is. Like I talked about earlier with Anima Visage, Gwen also works pretty well with it as a pseudo tank, so it's definitely acceptable on her if you have a bunch of items on your main tank or no main tank in your Gwen comp. It's also quite good on K'Sante and Jarvan. They do enjoy the stats from it, but it can make the positioning for Jarvan and K'Sante a little bit weird, as they're a little more positioning dependent than the other units here, and so you lose a bit of your flexibility because they can't have any units next to them, so do keep that in mind. It's a bit more impactful for K'Sante because you won't be able to adjust him 1 hex to try and kick a specific unit. Jarvan, as long as he's in the general area, is usually going to be fine, but just keep that in mind that I do like it a little less on these 2 units because it griefs their positioning a little. The final item we have is going to be Zhonya's Paradox. Now the thing with Zhonya's Paradox is it's going to be pretty weak in the early game and very strong in the late game. This is due to the fact that it gives your carry a few extra seconds of invulnerability, which is going to be pretty weak in the early game because fights are pretty slow, but in the late game, due to the fact that fights are really fast, a few extra seconds can be a huge swing. Zhonya's gives armor, magic resist, and AP, meaning we ideally want to be using it on an AP bruiser because they're going to be using the stats the best, right? A backline unit's not going to be using the armor and magic resist very well, and an AD unit isn't going to be using the AP very well. This means in the early game, the best holder of it is going to be Viego because he's going to enjoy the armor, magic resist, and AP. That being said, if you don't have a Viego, you can simply throw this on whatever early AP carry you have. These are the most common examples right here, but any early AP carry will work. In the late game, the best uses of this are going to be Katarina and Gwen due to the fact that they're going to be AP bruisers, so they'll be utilizing all the stats from it, as well as getting into the enemy team and taking damage, so they'll enjoy the survivability. Kai'Sa is another great user of it because of the fact that Kai'Sa will dash and a lot of times take damage wherever she dashes to, so it gives her a bit of extra survivability. It also can be really nice to allow Kai'Sa to clutch up a final ult at the end of the fight. She might be taking a lot of damage when there's like 4 units remaining. She ults and she would have died before the ult went all the way through, but Zhonya's allows her to get the full ult off. In addition, it's really good with AP carry units that have a lot of backloaded damage. Rageblade, Kayle, and Kalista are great examples of this, as is Azir. A lot of times at the end of the fight, the enemy team will kill your whole team. They'll have like 3 or 4 units left and their whole team will go onto your carry. But the Zhonya's giving a few extra seconds will actually allow your Azir to go through and kill the enemy team, clutching up the fight. It's going to be a lot better on these units than something like a Lux that doesn't really have the same potential to 1v4 at the end of a fight, due to the fact that they're going to have a lot more front-loaded damage as opposed to back-loaded damage. Ahri is another great user of this. It's going to enable her to get to her 3rd cast almost always, which is a significant power spike for her. In addition, you can use this on a AD bruiser as well as a substitute for Edge of Night. Yasuo is a great example here. You are going to be losing out on the value of the AP from the Zhonya's, and the 30 AP is definitely a pretty significant deal, so you are losing a good amount of value if you put it on an AD bruiser, but sometimes that is going to be your best option, so putting it on something like a Yasuo is definitely acceptable as a substitute for Edge of Night. If you made it to the end of this video, I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next video.